Peace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship. The peace of Jesus goes to change our lives, and the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. We are at the very beginning of our new series, the Summer Terms Bible Studies, looking at selected passages from First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and this conversation will be about the rise and fall of the Hebrew kingdom. Heavy, heavy is the crown. So, as we're looking at that, this is lesson one. We're going to be looking at King Saul and King David, looking at the differences between them, looking at how they are the first two Hebrew kings over the United Kingdom, but we're also using this to enter into a discussion about what it means to be a king of Israel. This is the first video in this first lesson, and it's an introduction. It's going to be looking at how the entire narrative from Joshua through Second Kings is shaped by Deuteronomy. The authors over this series of books are trying to tell a story about the rise and fall of the Hebrew kingdom that is explained through the lens of Deuteronomy. So, and again, like Joshua through Kings, although probably written over several hundred years by different anonymous authors, tells one continuous narrative from the conquest of Canaan until the exile in Babylon. So it is this story that goes from Joshua leading them into Canaan to conquer the land all the way out to the exile in 586 out of the land into Babylon. And just so you can see how there's even some phrasing in this that shows us that who was writing this kind of had the same sort of vision as the other authors of what's going on. Joshua 1:1 begins with after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. Judges 1:1 begins with after the death of Joshua. 2 Samuel 1:1 begins with after the death of Saul. And 2 Kings 1:1 begins with after the death of Ahab. And it's interesting to note with that 2 Samuel 1:1, Samuel was just one book. It was split into two scrolls. It was too long for one scroll to be very effective on just one scroll, so it was split into two scrolls. And that second scroll started, they decided to split First and Second Samuel by that phrase after the death of Saul. And it's interesting, it's kind of like in the middle of the book, whereas Joshua and Judges begins with it. This is in the middle of the book, and it kind of shows the rising arc of getting to David and the falling arc of getting from David to Solomon in that space, but kind of a climactic point moving from Saul to David. And it's very interesting that it's after the death of Saul. There isn't phrasing in First and Second Samuel about after the death of Samuel or after the death of David or after the death of Solomon. Three very important figures in First and Second Samuel, but not phrased in the same way as Moses, Joshua, or Saul. That's interesting that they see the death of Saul as the transition into something new. And even more interesting is Second Kings 1:1 after the death of Ahab. Ahab is notoriously one of the worst kings, probably the worst king in the northern kingdom of Israel. Manasseh could be argued the worst king in the southern kingdom of Judah. But after the death of Ahab, that means the writers of First and Second Kings saw a transition with Ahab. And it could be argued that after the death of Ahab, it is just about exile. about the destruction of the northern kingdom leading into the destruction of the southern kingdom. And that conversation is Ahab is the pivotal feature that explains what's going on in those as well. So these 4 to 6 books, technically First and Second Samuel are written as one piece. First and Second Kings are written as one piece. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings all have phrasing, important phrasing that delineates some of the narrative marking with this after the death of um, Moses, Joshua, Saul, and Ahab are how the authors of these books solve the transitions in their narrative in a very interesting way. Okay, so looking closer at kind of the purpose of Kings, or even the story of Joshua through Kings, especially when it compares to First and Second Chronicles, it helps us understand why they were written. Joshua through Kings traces the rise and fall of the Hebrew kingdom through the lens of Deuteronomy. A significant purpose to this narrative, especially in First and Second Kings, is to explain to the Jews who are in exile in Babylon why they are in exile. I would say at least First and Second Kings. The reason why First and Second Kings were written, or the perspective from which First and Second Kings are written, is to explain to Jews in Babylon why they're in Babylon, what went wrong in the Hebrew kingdom. Why did God send them into exile? And we can see that because First and Second Chronicles retells much of the same story, even using Joshua through Kings, especially First and Second Kings, as a source. It uses a lot of information from First and Second Kings, but it tells the story with a different purpose. There are differences between First and Second Chronicles and First and Second Kings. First and Second Chronicles is shaped by Ezra and Nehemiah with the intention to explain how the Jews returning from exile can remain in the land. So basically, First and Second Kings is written to explain why we're in exile. First and Second Chronicles is written to help us never go back into exile. And we can see some of the differences. And one of the huge differences is how they talk about sin. First and Second Kings highlights the growing corporate and generational guilt of the nations of Israel and Judah as an explanation for the suffering of the exile. So, First and Second Kings really talks about how the people were guilty, how the king was guilty, how the land was corrupted, how the nation fell, and really, and how previous generations' sins led to the suffering of the current generation. Whereas First and Second Chronicles highlights how individual righteousness or wickedness of the kings of Judah specifically, First and Second Chronicles doesn't deal much with the northern kingdom of Israel, but the kings of Judah affected God's blessing on their lives. We see much more about what those individual kings did and the direct results of their sin in their lifetime. First and Second Kings, Joshua through Kings, is a grand sweeping narrative about how the sins of the people led them to exile. First and Second Chronicles is much more individualized, talking about how the sin that that king committed directly affected the events in that king's life, or the good that that king did directly affected the blessings in that king's life. So, same story, different purposes, and different highlights of the material that they choose to use. Now, as I'm saying, we're going to be looking through First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and their Deuteronomy centered narratives, Deuteronomy shaped narratives. Let's look at some of the passages in Deuteronomy that may give us the flavor of what we're looking at in Kings. Deuteronomy 28:36 through 37. The Lord will drive you and the king you set over you to a nation unknown to you or your ancestors. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone. You will become a thing of horror, a byword, an object of ridicule among all the peoples where the Lord will drive you. Later in that chapter, just as it pleased the Lord to make you prosper, increase in number, so it will please him to ruin and destroy you. You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, the gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. Looking a little bit further, 29, a covenant the Lord is making with you this day and sealing it with an oath to confirm you this day as his people, that he may be your God as he promised you and as he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am making this covenant with its oath, not only with you who are standing here with us today in the presence of the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here. You yourselves know how we lived in Egypt and how we passed through the countries on the way here. So we see this God's going to judge you for your sins with the exile, not only with this covenant in Deuteronomy is not only about the people standing there, but is about the former people. Interestingly enough, you know what it was like in Egypt, those lines. Deuteronomy was written right before they entered into, or spoken right before they entered into Canaan. All the people who experienced Egypt had died in the desert. So that generation had passed. So the next generation was about to enter the conquest, but Deuteronomy still says you know what it was like in Egypt because they had been told. So we see this generational connection between the previous generation, the conquest generation, and also this is saying the covenant is not only made with the current generation, but those who are not yet here, it is made with them as well. So Deuteronomy quite talks a lot about how the people sin over generations, and God holds the nation accountable for the sins of the people. And then also the king is involved in that as well. So some questions to think about as we look at this. Can groups of people be guilty of sin or just individuals? And what would it look like for individuals to just be sinful or entire groups of people? Can the sin have a generational effect? What does that look like? What are some sins that our people, whoever your people is, whoever my people are, what are some sins of our people might be guilty of? Whatever group you identify yourself with, what are some of the generational or societal or social sins of our people? That's more than just individual sin. What are some effects of sin that might have been passed down to us from previous generations on a family level and on a societal level? Fascinating conversation questions. We're going to be talking about those in our group on Sunday night. Hope if you have anything to contribute to them, any thoughts about them, drop down in the comments section. I would love to hear your responses to those questions as we look at how the Joshua through Kings narrative tries to explain why the Israelites are in exile due to the sins of the people over generations. As always, I enjoy having these conversations with you, and there are ways to participate with it in person Sunday nights at 5 p.m. in the JEMIC and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and or WordPress. I'm all over the social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. Like, subscribe, and follow as appropriate. I enjoyed having this conversation with you, and hopefully it continues real soon.